それではまず OECD-FAO 農業アウトルックの概要についてまとめた短いビデオをご覧いただきたいと思います。
Our world is constantly changing, influencing and impacting the global food and agriculture sector. Environmental challenges demand innovative solutions. New technologies improve the way we produce, process, transport and market food. Consumer preferences shift. In order to develop the most effective policies and plans for the sector, decision makers need to know what's coming our way, the possible future trends, and factors driving global demand and supply, trade, and the pricing of the world's main agricultural commodities. To assist them, the OECD-FAO Agricultural Outlook provides a comprehensive baseline scenario for how agricultural commodities, fish, and biofuel markets could evolve at national, regional, and global levels over the next decade, analyzing countries in 7 geographical regions around the world and examining 40 different agricultural commodities, including cereals, oilseeds, meats, fish, dairy products, sugar, some fruits and pulses, and even cotton and biofuels. The Outlook is a rich and reliable source of information for government, industry, and academia. Commodity, policy, and country experts from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations work together to compile this globally recognized annual publication. Along with extensive research and computer modeling, they also consulted widely with experts from national institutions and international commodity organizations to come up with the most unbiased, transparent, and plausible projection possible. It's important to understand that the baseline projection is not a forecast about the future, but rather a plausible scenario based on certain assumptions around macroeconomic conditions, agriculture and trade policy settings, weather conditions, longer-term productivity trends, and international market developments. Given that there are risks and uncertainties associated with the baseline projection, the publication also discusses possible alternative scenarios with different market outcomes. The underlying modeling system can be used in follow-up ex-ante scenario analysis of individual markets, countries, and issues, helping to guide policy decisions, for instance, on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the African swine fever disease, the growing demand for alternative proteins, new biofuel policies, and many others. With stronger projections on future trends in the agriculture and food sector, we can make better decisions, taking us closer to our global goals for zero hunger, a cleaner environment, and more resilient communities.
それでは本日の目玉であります OECD-FAO 農業アウトルックの編纂に関わったエコノミストチームのリーダーのご登場です。ヨーロッパは朝早い時間ですが、日本の関係者のためにライブでご登壇いただくことをご快諾いただきました。改めまして、ご質問等ございましたら Q&A セクションに書き込みをお願いいたします。それではまず FAO のホルガー・マティ博士に世界の食料生産の展望と課題についての講演をお願いいたします。
Yes, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone in Japan. It's my pleasure to be here. So I understand the Secretariat will share the presentation. So I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this event together and giving us a chance to discuss the outlook with our Japanese colleagues. In my presentation today, I will briefly introduce the joint outlook, then discuss our findings on consumption and production before handing over to my colleague Hubertus from OECD. Next slide, please. Sorry, is the Secretariat advancing the slides? Yes, thank you very much. Perfect, so please move to the first one. Next one, please. Yes, thank you. So the publication that we're talking about today here actually has four main parts. There is the main body of the outlook that we used to call the overview, which presents the trends and prospects. That holds the main results, main finding, main messages, all summarized, on a more global context, and it receives the most attention. We there have also special boxes that cover special topics like fruits and vegetables, potential for Africa, sustainable development goals, and also a look at further developments. Then we have 6 regional briefs that provide more detailed information on the projects, projections, and prospects of the different geographical regions. And then we still have the commodity chapters. To me, they are the heart and soul of the outlook because they provide the in-depth information on the commodity groups. In there, we also have different boxes that deal with specific aspects. And then we also provide a statistical annex, but our database can also be downloaded from our website. Next, please. So the OECD and FAO provide this outlook jointly, and we produce it together. And to highlight a couple of the differences and also the process in general, I prepared a little scheme here. So let's see if we can go through this together quickly. So first, click, please. So on the, yep, okay, thank you. On the FAO side, which you see on the bottom in blue, there is the starting point. We start actually with our model that the JIRCA's president just very well described and provided the background. So yes, this is the type of model that we use to provide the initial projections for the countries that we cover. But then, as we just heard, those models have a lot of limitations. So we get expert input from our commodity experts that we hope can, make up for those shortcomings and bring in the things that the model doesn't cover. And sort of the same happens on the OECD side, but with a different procedure. There they get commodity projections in their questionnaire responses where that expert input is already embodied. And then they calibrate the model to that. Next. Then we join both models, and then it becomes the well-known AgLink COSIMO. Next. And with that joint model, then we produce our commodity projections and derive our findings. And they are subject to a lot of scrutiny and revision and input, where also Japanese experts are closely involved. Next. So once there is agreement on the numbers, we provide the full publication and all its parts that I just showed. Next. And again, it is scrutinized, it receives feedback from inside and outside the organizations. Again, the member countries, including Japan, are closely involved. And once there is a consensus, then the outlook is released. As you can see on the bottom, this takes quite a long time. So we start in November and typically it's released in July. Thank you. Next. So we just heard already about the model. Here is a quick overview over the model that we use. It is a partial equilibrium model of supply and demand of agricultural markets. So for each commodity and each country, we model what you see on the left side, the demand, and on the right side, the supply. And the markets in each country, each commodity are cleared by a domestic price. And then the surplus or deficit of each country is transferred into a global clearing process where, again, a global market price clears the market. So that model allows us to really connect every country, every commodity with each other and provide, a total equilibrium. And after the baseline, the model also allows to run scenario analysis to see the impact of different factors. Next. So now, after the background, I would like to briefly introduce our macroeconomic and policy assumptions. Thank you. Next. So here on the left-hand side, you see a chart of the future increments in population, because population, of course, for food demand is the most important factor. So, and as you see here, the growth in population is declining. It's kind of shifting down. So most of the countries and regions decline. The exception really is on the bottom, sub-Saharan Africa, which still is growing strongly. What you also see on the right chart where the growth rates are. So they still grow at about 2.5%, while all the other are declining and at a much lower level. So based on these assumptions, we see about 8.5 billion people in 2030. Next, please. The other most important driver is the economic growth of countries and the resulting income per capita. The chart here shows a disaggregation of what's attributed to per capita growth and what's attributed to population growth. And you see there that most countries and regions growth is predominantly attributed to per capita growth, as we just saw, because population growth is declining. But again, there are exceptions, and you see here again the exception of sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa and the Near East that still have a very strong population growth. So globally, we project, or it's not we project, we use the projections of the World Bank and the IMF, 1.9% over the coming decade. That follows the strong decline in 2020 due to the pandemic, and is assuming that the recovery will start in 2021. So next, please. A quick look at our assumptions in the financial area. So we also use exchange rates, and so they are important for trade. And the projections show a couple of moderate shifts, but it's not supposed to be a major shifter in our projections. Everything is relatively moderate and smooth in the financial projections. The oil price is our proxy for energy prices, and there we use a projection of $74 for 2030. So next, please. One last look at our policy consideration. So the convention in this type of outlook is that policies are held constant at their current state. I'd like to mention, because I'm sure you're aware and you have been reading about various regional trade agreements that just have been signed, but because they're relatively new and they're not really put in place everywhere and the implications are not quite clear, they are not sort of considered as a major impact into the markets. So thanks. Next, please. So far the setup, and now I would like to introduce our consumption projections. Next, please. Starting with a global overview over the major uses that we consider: food, feed, fuel, and industrial applications. And as you see in this chart, where these uses are mapped for the major commodities that we consider, the shares of the different uses are not projected to change significantly because no major shift in consumption is expected, like we had 15 years ago when biofuels suddenly emerged. So we don't see anything like this, but we see a slowdown in the growth rates compared to the last decade. And the next slide will show kind of why we see that, what is behind that. And you see here a disaggregation of the demand per capita and demand due to population growth. And you see the demand per capita is declining for most commodities for various reasons. For cereals, it's really saturation effects that we have reached. For vegetable oils is that the growth in biodiesel is really subsiding. Then there are exceptions for high value commodities like meat and dairy. There we still see a strong continuation of the per capita demand growth, which we also see more in a second. Next, please. So now here we look more regionally and we focus on food specifically. Before was total demand, including biofuel. Now here we focus directly on food for the different regions and the main commodities. And when you look at sort of the different columns here, you see that the bulk of the additional demand will originate in regions with high population growth: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Near East, North Africa. And these are the regions that consume the bulk of staples and sugar, so they contribute the bulk of the growth. There are exceptions. For instance, China is going to dominate the meat and the fish growth, and India and Pakistan will really be the ones where the demand for dairy products will grow the strongest. Next, please. So this one takes sort of a different view and tries to highlight how different economic groups will evolve in their nutrition. We have already heard now there about the nutritional aspects, and Sophie highlighted the difficulties, and that reflects what we also already heard now, that these problems are likely to persist and in various ways. So we have the global projections that average food availability will grow about 4% to about 3,000 calories. So I like to remind you that this is not intake, it is food consumption in a national accounting sense. So everything that's available for consumption, but then a lot of it is also wasted and lost. So that is still included here. If we look at the different income groups, that high income countries, no surprise now, they're relatively stable in their total volumes, but there we have more shifts within the groups. So we move to higher quality cuts in meat, and we move from red meat more to poultry. But the overall volume doesn't change much. The volume changes, as you see, are really in the middle income countries, because there, as you saw before, we have the income growth, and we also have, still a high propensity to spend the marginal income on food. And the upper middle, they will really be the ones that move mostly on animal products, meat, while lower ones are still fats and sugar more. And they are actually the ones that add the most calories. While in the low income group, because of the income constraints, we don't see a lot of changes, and the little that we have are mostly in staples and sugar. So moves to a healthier diet are very slow. So we do need some changes here. That's clearly coming out from this outlook. Next, please. So as I said, we have more demand for animal products, and if we have more animals, we need to have more feed, and that is really highlighted here. On the left chart, you see the maize and protein meals. These are the two most important components in commercial operations, feeding of non-ruminants mostly. And here we still have strong growth, even though the protein meal consumption growth is slowing down quite a bit because of structural changes in China. The other components are also all increasing, but at much lower volumes. And on the right-hand side, you see where that feed is used, and you see China still growing strong, the EU being a strong feed user, but not growing similarly for the US, even though they're growing a little bit. But we also have emerging regions in Southeast Asia, also Brazil, India, where we do have growth, but the bulk of the feed will still be used sort of in traditional producers. Next, please. And that concludes my view on consumption, where I'd like to mention our views on biofuel. And the point I'm trying to make here is really that it is still a big factor in terms of volume, but it is not a big factor in terms of growth, because it's relatively flat. It's just growing like by 5% ethanol, 7% biodiesel over the 10 years. So the other demands, as we saw before, like feed demand for maize grows faster than fuel. So that's why the share of maize in total use is declining, as you see in the first column. For sugarcane, it's relatively constant because of Brazil. Vegetable oil, the EU, is actually declining in its use. So therefore, the share is falling. Molasses is a bit different. So that's one is still growing because of the ethanol projections in India, but that's kind of a waste product anyway. So the message here is it's still there, but it's not a growth factor. And that concludes consumption. So let's move to production. Next, please. And next. So in my coverage of production, I'll start with a basic overview over the regional production of the main sectors: crops, livestock, and fisheries. And you see here on the left, we singled out India and China because they're so important and they're such big volume producers. And you see there a lot of additional production will happening also in the other Southeast Asian countries. Also in Latin America is growth. The traditional ones, the Europe, North America, they're big, but they're slower in growth. On the opposite end, we have quite optimistic views on the progress that will be made in sub-Saharan Africa and also the Near East, as you see by those relatively high growth rates. Now, those are those black dots there. But in total volume, they will remain small. And you see the effect of this in the trade later on that Hubertus will cover. So next, please. And the underlying growth factors that we see are shown here. So this is the decomposition of the growth factors for crops. And we look at land use here. We look at intensification, so multi-cropping, and yields. And yield is the green one. And you see that our view is that really yield will dominate the growth in crop production. It will be the dominant factor to have increasing productivity, which of course means we need to have a lot of investments in research and development, but also in the availability and application of fertilizer, of chemicals, of water, and so on. It's not coming on its own. It requires strong efforts. But if these efforts are made, then, and our experts tell us that these efforts are possible and these yield growth is feasible, then these would be sort of the impact that about 90% of all additional crops can be attributed to yield growth. And you see by region, it varies a little bit. So some regions are still adding some areas. So we have like soybeans, especially in Brazil, and cereals in Eastern Europe and Central Asia that will bring in new land. But then we also have some land going out, some rice land going out. So there are some trade-offs. So overall, not much extra land is expected to come in. Next, please. Thank you. Quick look at livestock. So here I just mapped the different production, so you get an impression of the different volumes of the various livestock sectors. The point I'm trying to show here, sort of milk and poultry production are the ones that grow the most. Poultry will account for about half the extra meat. And on the fish side, aquaculture is where the extra volume will coming from. Capture production is held almost constant. as we saw before on the feed side, the traditional producers and regions will continue to be dominant in the global livestock and fish production. Next, please. So that is a little more detailed for the dairy industry, just to illustrate where and how growth is going to happen there. So you really see the big bubble of India. So this is the growth volume, because India is the one that will really lead the growth in milk production. And as you see here on the bottom axis, you have the additional cows. So they add about 2% cows a year. And on the vertical axis, you see the change in yield. So the cows are also improving their performance. That's also due for Pakistan, for sub-Saharan Africa, while on the other end, sort of traditional producers like the European Union, New Zealand, Australia, the big exporters, they will actually reduce their cows numbers and just expand on the growth of yields per cow. The Americas are somewhere in the middle. So, and the last one, please, next one. So this, what I just showed here, adding extra ruminants, extra cows, that is actually the main reason why we still think that emissions from agriculture will still grow by about 4%. So that is in the top chart here. So ruminants and livestock in general will account for about 80% of the additional emissions. And on the bottom chart, you see that regionally, so as you just saw for dairy, but that's also, meat animals are contributing here. In these regions that use sort of very traditional technologies, herding, a lot of, pasture-based ruminants in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is where the initial emissions will be generated. But then on the bottom chart, we have the comparison of the blue bar is the output and the green one is the emissions. And you see the output outweighs the growth in emissions. So which means that the production systems will be less carbon intensive. So, and this is the good news. And with this good news, I will hand it over to my colleague, Hubertus, to continue the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
ドクターホルガー、ありがとうございました。